Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another beautiful Ladybird book in their series, An Adventure from History. These books were published a long time ago by an English company in Loughborough called Wills and Hepworth. And this is King Alfred the Great. What's nice about this book, lots of things in fact, but I've still got the dust cover on this one. So we know that this sold for a price in olden money of 2 shillings and sixpence. So, for example, one of these is what's called a florin, and this was 2 shillings. This one is from 1937. So this coin was produced or minted a few years before this book came out, but using the same old money, 2 shillings and sixpence. And it says inside the fly cover or the dust jacket, King Alfred the Great. This is the first title in a new and fascinating Adventures from History series, which will feature famous men and women through the centuries. This story is vividly but truthfully and simply told. Other titles are in preparation. And we know what some of those other titles are, because we've got them listed in the back of the book. And I've got all of these in my little library here at home, so I'll try and find them and share them with you. The first one is this one for today, King Alfred the Great, William the Conqueror, Sir Walter Raleigh, the story of Nelson, the first Queen Elizabeth, the story of Captain Cook, Florence Nightingale, Julius Caesar and Roman Britain, the story of Charles II, and David Livingstone. And I've already got some of these recorded for you here on the channel. So have a look at the different playlists or search for these titles and you'll find them here. And those that I haven't yet read, I will find. So inside we've got a nice image displaying a map of southern and southeastern England and the arrival of outside forces onto the south coast in the Kingdom of Kent, the Kingdom of Guthrum and Mercia and Wessex. Let us see what we get with reading this. King Alfred the Great from series 561, written by L. Dugard Peach with illustrations by John Kenny. And this is amazing, the King Alfred's Jewel. I've been to see that with my youngest son in what it says here is the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's in a beautiful glass case. You can walk around it and get very close to it, and you can see what a pretty thing it is. King Alfred the Great. This book tells you something of what England was like 1,000 years ago, and of the King, Alfred the Great, who was on the throne. Today, England is one country, divided into counties like Yorkshire and Devonshire. But 1,000 years ago, it was made up of a number of small kingdoms, each with a different king. The Kingdom of Wessex, ruled by King Alfred, was the southern part of England. Further north, there was the Kingdom of Mercia, and to the east, East Anglia. The 5 towns, Derby, Nottingham, Lincoln, Leicester and Stamford, made up yet another kingdom called the 5 boroughs. If you look at the map at the end of this book, it will show you exactly how England was divided up. Nearly all of the people who dwelt in these little kingdoms lived in small towns and villages, working on the land, growing their own food, spinning and weaving the cloth for their clothes, and never going far from their homes. This was a simple way of living, and everybody could have been very happy if it had not been for the Danes. These were fierce sea raiders from the north, who came in their long black ships and attacked the peaceful English farmers. No man's life was safe, and no one knew when he might return home from his work in the fields to find his wife and children gone and his house burnt to the ground. Into this troubled country a little prince was born in Wessex. He was the son of Ethelwulf the king and Queen Osburga. His name was Alfred, and he grew up to be one of the wisest kings who ever sat on the English throne. In those early days, very few people could read or write, sometimes not even kings and queens. But Alfred's mother could read, and it was her example which encouraged Alfred to learn. One day she was reading some stories to Alfred and his 3 brothers. The stories were not printed in a book because printing had not yet been invented. Everything had to be written by hand, and pages of the manuscripts were decorated with gold and coloured letters. Although Alfred could not read, he loved looking at the coloured pages and wanted to have the book for his very own. Osburger saw how interested her sons were and promised to give the book to the first of them who could read it. Alfred quickly found someone to teach him, and soon the book was his. We know nothing about Alfred during the years when he was growing into a young man, but we do know that meanwhile the Danes were sending more and more men to invade England. Soon all the eastern and northern parts of the country were conquered by them. Alfred's 3 elder brothers were all kings of the English during this period, and Alfred helped them to fight the Danes. But the first thing we know about him for certain is that he was married to Ellsworth when he was 20 years old, and it was a very splendid wedding in the Saxon Cathedral of Winchester. Winchester Cathedral has been rebuilt since Alfred's marriage, but there are still Saxon churches in England. We recognise them by the heavy, undecorated pillars and round arches shown in the picture. All this time there was fighting all over England between the Danes and the English, and usually the Danes had the better of it. However, in a battle at Ashdown on the Berkshire Hills, when Alfred was only 21, he and his soldiers won a great victory. Everybody was so glad that they had at last beaten the Danes in a battle that they decided to do something which would make people remember the victory forever. So the soldiers went up the hillside and cut away the turf in the shape of a horse. Because the ground underneath was chalk, it showed up as a great white horse galloping along the hill. What is more, it is still there to this day in memory of Alfred's victory. The year after this battle, Alfred's 3rd brother died, and Alfred became king over all Wessex. In those days, the king was not crowned in London because it had been conquered by the Danes. So Alfred's coronation was in the old town of Winchester, the capital of Wessex, which was still the southwestern part of the country and held by the English. Alfred rose on a horse to his coronation, surrounded by Saxons all armed and ready to fight the Danes at any moment. When he entered the cathedral, the ceremony of the coronation was the same as when our present Queen Elizabeth was crowned, and as it has always been celebrated from that day to this. If ever you go to Winchester, you should try to see the statue of King Alfred on his horse, riding to his coronation. Alfred was now king, but he was not king of a peaceful, happy country, for the Danes were always attacking the towns and villages, and a great victory like the one at Ashdown was not repeated. It was Christmastide, and like everyone else, King Alfred and his friends were enjoying a Christmas feast at a place called Chippenham in Wiltshire. Then, suddenly, whilst they were all happily eating and drinking, there were shouts outside, and the sound of clashing swords. The Danes had come. Alfred and his men seized their weapons and dashed out into the streets, leaving their Christmas dinner uneaten on the table. But they were so surprised and unprepared that their resistance was of no use, and the Danes, organised and fighting fiercely, were too strong for men who, only a moment before, had been thinking of nothing but enjoying a happy and peaceful Christmas. Many of King Alfred's men were killed by the Danes, but he and a few faithful followers escaped and found refuge amongst the swamps and marshes at Athelney in Somerset. They crossed the swamps in little boats made of branches and the skins of animals, or on bundles of rushes tied together to form rafts, and built a camp on some firm ground in the middle. Here they thought they were safe. But the Danes were soon hunting them again, determined to kill King Alfred and conquer England for themselves. Often Alfred and his soldiers had to hide and disguise themselves to escape their fierce enemies. It was whilst Alfred was in hiding, disguised as a poor peasant, that he knocked one day at the door of a lonely hut in the marshes, and he asked for shelter. A peasant woman opened the door and, taking pity on Alfred, told him that he could come in and rest. She was baking some cakes, and asked Alfred to see that they did not burn while she went to the well. But Alfred was thinking about how to beat the Danes, and so he forgot all about the cakes, which were soon burnt to cinders. When the woman returned and found her cakes ruined, she was naturally angry, and not knowing that Alfred was the king, she scolded him bitterly and, even as some of the stories tell, beat him with her broomstick. We can well imagine the woman's surprise when some of Alfred's followers appeared and, going down on one knee, saluted the ragged peasant as their king. Quickly she too was on her knees begging for forgiveness. But she had nothing to fear. King Alfred was just a man. "Rise, good dame," he said. "I betrayed your trust. You had every reason to be angry. Go in peace." This story may not be true, but at least we know that Alfred was in Athelney, because 900 years later a gold and enamel brooch belonging to him was found in the marshes. On it were the words, "Alfred meet heat gewein," which means in modern English, "Alfred caused me to be made." While Alfred was hiding in the marshes of Somerset, he set himself to gather together an army, and soon he had hundreds of men armed and ready. But before he attacked the Danes, Alfred wanted to send a spy into their camp to find out how many of them were and what sort of weapons they had. This was very dangerous, for if the Danes discovered the spy, they would kill him. So Alfred decided to go himself. As well as being a brave fighter, Alfred could play on the harp and sing songs, and he boldly went into the Danes' camp disguised as a minstrel. The Danes liked music and singing and gladly welcomed him. So not only did Alfred find out about them, but the leader of the Danes, Guthrum, paid him for his music. Alfred now knew all that he needed to know about the Danish army, and he marched out of Athelney with his soldiers to meet the enemy. The two armies met at Edington in Wiltshire, and the army fought so fiercely that the Danes were completely defeated by the English. One reason for their defeat was that early in the battle the English captured the famous Raven banner. This was a flag with a great black bird embroidered on it, which the Danes believed had magic powers. Always it had brought them victory, and now that it was lost, the Danes lost heart also. When these fierce fighting men saw that the banner had gone, they threw down their arms and surrendered. With the defeat of Guthrum at Edington, Alfred had brought peace to England, at least for the time being. This was the first part of the task which he had set himself, so he now turned to the second. Guthrum was a Dane and a heathen, and Alfred's lifelong desire was to see England once more a Christian land. Guthrum and the heathens who followed him were now at Alfred's mercy, and one of the conditions of the terms of peace was that Guthrum and his men should become Christians. They were all baptized in a great and impressive ceremony at a place near Athelney, and at this ceremony the heathen name of Guthrum was changed to Athelstan. At the same time, Alfred and Athelstan agreed to divide England between them. Athelstan was to rule over all the land to the north of the old Roman road called Watling Street, while Alfred was to remain king of the rest of England. Many traces of this division of the country remain to this day, and the names of towns and villages ending in burg or by or bury show that the Danes built them. For example, Denby means the village of the Danes. There are many other Danish words which we still use as names of places. Thorpe was the Danish word for a little town, and people still call the hills in the north of England by the Danish name of fells. For a long time the city of London had been in the hands of the Danes. That is why, you remember, Alfred had to be crowned at Winchester instead of in London. But now, by the arrangement with Athelstan, London again became part of Alfred's kingdom. When he entered London, he found that it was mostly in ruins, and it was necessary to rebuild it almost completely. Alfred, who was a very practical man, played a large part in this. He often went amongst the workmen, showing them how things should be done. Where the Romans had once built a fortress, Alfred raised a Saxon tower. This was afterwards rebuilt by William the Conqueror, and is the Tower of London which we know today. For a while, England was peaceful. Athelstan kept his promise and no longer marched with his men to attack the towns under Alfred. But there were still a great many Danes over the seas, and these looked with envy on the rich and peaceful land of England. They were not bound by the treaty made with Athelstan, and so, once more, Danish ships appeared off the coast. This time they were commanded by a Dane called Hastinga, after whom the English town of Hastings is named. After attacking and burning towns on the coast, the Danes became bolder, and one morning they sailed right up the Thames to London with 80 ships. The news of enemy ships on the Thames was quickly brought to the king, but there was nothing he could do. At that time there was no British navy, and Alfred had no ships of any kind which could fight the ships of Hastinga. The Danes, sailed on until they reached the River Lee, which joins the Thames about 7 miles below the London Bridge. Here they anchored their ships and built a strong fort on the riverbank. The fort was too strong for Alfred and his men to attack, so he thought of another way of defeating the Danes. With all his men he started to build a dam across the river, and one morning the Danes awoke to find that their ships were high and dry. When the Danes saw that their retreat by water was cut off, they lost heart. Leaving the fort by which they had built on the riverside, the Danes hurried away by land to the coast. Soon they reached the other ships they had left there and sailed away to their homeland in the north. But Alfred had learned his lesson. He began to build ships, bigger and better ships than those of the Danes. Big oak trees were cut down in the royal forests, and in every harbour on the south coast, shipwrights were busy. This was the far-off beginning of what we today call the Royal Navy, whose ships have guarded our coasts ever since the days of Alfred. From time to time the Danes did try to come back, but now they found that there were ships ready to fight them before they landed. Moreover, Alfred ordered men to keep watch on the cliffs all round the coast, so that whenever the enemy ships were sighted, the alarm was raised. Immediately armed men lined the shore, and the English ships put out to sea. Soon the Danes realized that England, under the wise rule of King Alfred, was too strong for them. For Alfred had not only built ships and arranged lookout posts on the cliffs, he had gathered all the men of England into an army called the Fyrd. This was a sort of home guard, ready at any time to defend the homeland. King Alfred had now achieved something which seemed impossible when he first came to the throne. He had brought peace to England and united the whole country under his rule. Now he could turn his thoughts to other things. Ever since he had learned to read as a little boy, Alfred had loved books, but there were no books written in a language which ordinary people in England could understand. So, in order to have time in which to write such books, Alfred decided that he would divide his day into 3 parts: 8 hours working, 8 hours sleeping, and 8 hours of reading and writing new books in the English language. But first, Alfred had to have some way of telling the time, because clocks had not yet been invented, so he thought of the candle clock. This was a candle marked with coloured rings, 1 to each hour. As the candle burned down, it showed how many hours had passed since it was lit. In King Alfred's time, however, the ordinary people could not read. Only those who lived in monasteries were interested in reading and writing, or in learning anything except their own trade. But without learning, and what is called research, that is, looking for new knowledge, there can be no progress. Before the Danes came, there were many monasteries in England, but these had all been destroyed in the fighting up and down the country. Alfred therefore decided to build many new monasteries, and schools as well. Scholars and teachers were brought to England from many countries, for Alfred knew what pleasure and knowledge he had himself gained from reading, and he wished to share with his people all that he had learned to read, and to share his pleasure and ability to gain knowledge. Part of Alfred's desire for knowledge was a wish to know more about other countries and about those parts of the earth which had not yet been explored. So he encouraged men to go north and south, east and west, and then come back and tell him of the things they had seen. One of these explorers was ALFRED, a very brave and tough sea captain. ALFRED sailed away northward in his little ship, past the north of Scotland and the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and up the coast of Norway into the world of storms and ice. Here he found that in summer the sun never sets. This was something which no one from England had ever known or seen before, and Alfred wrote about this new knowledge which ALFRED had brought in one of his books. Today, wherever you live in England, in town or country, you are in one of the shires into which Alfred divided his kingdom. It was not easy for Alfred to do this in the days when there were no proper maps of the country and no means of making them. So Alfred had to send men in all directions, marking rivers, streams, hills and roads as the boundaries of counties and parishes. That is why today these boundaries so often run along the banks of rivers. They have not changed since King Alfred's men passed that way, driving in posts to mark the divisions. These were a few of the changes which the wise King Alfred achieved for England, and it is because of this that he is known in history as Alfred the Great. But there is one other thing, perhaps the greatest of all, and the one which is most important to every one of us today. English law and English justice are known and respected throughout the world, for in this country of ours it is almost impossible for an innocent man to be sent to prison. This we owe in the first place to King Alfred. So England became a free country, and we should always remember that it might have been very much less free if Alfred the Great had not lived and ruled 1,000 years ago. And that, my friends, is the story in this Ladybird book, published by Wills and Hepworth, of King Alfred the Great. let's just have another look before we close the book at what's inside this nice paper cover. There we go. There's the picture of King Alfred the Great holding aloft his sword, signifying his leadership and his ruling of the country. King Alfred the Great, a Ladybird history book. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. It's been a real pleasure for me to read this and to share it with you. Keep looking at the books we've got here for you on the channel. Drop me a little message in the comments and say where you are watching from. Tell me what you're enjoying specifically. And if you've got a particular book in a Ladybird series that you'd like me to find in my collection and share with you here, I'd be delighted to do so.